Hello and welcome to session 13 for today. I, as always, am Mr. Fowler. I'm so happy to see you today. I hope that you had a wonderful 4th of July weekend. I'm recording a Zoom session for today's course, and I realize that a few of my students may be Zooming in the midst of this lecture for today. But I wanted to touch upon a couple of key things right here at the pivot point of the semester. So let's start by queuing up today's lesson. So you should be able to see me over here in the upper right-hand corner. So for today's session, I had students review the analysis peer review worksheet. Let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick. Let's see here. Screen share, this one. So for the peer review worksheet, this analysis assignment asks you to, of course, include your name, the title of the paper that you're reviewing, and the name of the writer whose paper you are reviewing. And it's a pretty straightforward review of what we talked about during our first peer review session. Remember that the questions below are designed to help guide your comments with respect to the particular requirements for our second essay assignment. Don't just sing the praises of your fellow peer reviewer. Try to look at things that you feel could actually be improved upon in order to facilitate growth for the writing experience. So peer review questions, expand upon the spaces below, or if you wanted to print this for some reason, which I don't think we would need to do in this digital day and age, you could have printed this and written on the back or something like that. The first question, is there an effective hook that brings you in as a reader? If so, take a few minutes to write it below or copy it from the student's paper and paste it into the document. If there isn't a hook, I would challenge you to go one step further. What kind of a hook might bring you in as a reader, since one was not provided for you? Then what were the operating criteria that the author identified? And I emphasize the fact that there should be 3, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case. There may be less criteria necessary to evaluate this particular item, or the criteria might be more implicit. They might be implied or teased out ideas that only show up in the conclusion. Hopefully, though, as the majority of the papers that I reviewed illustrated, the criteria were identified right away and made pretty apparent. So what are the 3 operating criteria that they use? Then I'd like you to identify the paper's thesis statement and then paraphrase it, because paraphrasing is a nice tool to use, a powerful tool to use, especially as we get into this part of the semester where we're actually thinking ahead to the 3rd and final project for the semester, where we may want to use paraphrasing in order to make our points more clear. Use your own words and sentence structure to paraphrase the thesis statement from your fellow student. And finally, does she or he use effective in-text, meaning parenthetical, and works cited page citations? Is the quotation that is used introduced, quoted, and then discussed, like in the sandwich quotation method, which we studied earlier this semester? If you can't remember the sandwich quotation method, you can go back and review the video where we talked about that. It was in relation to How the Sound of the 80s Lives On Today by Mark Laughlin. So you can go back and review that part. Okay. Let's go back real quick just to make sure we are in the same boat here. All right, so that's something that we wanted to do. Then I was going to let you cut loose using the class list function up here. You should be able to now reach out to a fellow student and exchange drafts. If you were unable to do that, or if you're still floundering, you're not quite sure how to go about that, under the content section for the analysis paper, I have created a module called peer review. And if you expand that module, you'll see the peer review 2 worksheet, but also all sorts of anonymously titled drafts, anonymously titled because they do reveal the student's name in there, but not their grade. So you can double check this section and select one of these peer review items if you have not already done so. All right. So once you've completed that, it is time to talk a little bit about the hero's journey today. For next time, I'd like you to read Sam Greengard's Social Games and Virtual Goods, which you should find linked in Desire to Learn under the arguments section. Okay. So right away, just as a review, hello, Madison. How are you doing today?
Okay, am I the only one here?
So far, yeah. I'm just in the midst of recording. How was your 4th of July?
Okay.
Good. So I was just explaining to future viewers, as well as yourself, that I wanted to check in on the progress that Wade Watts had been making throughout the hero's journey. Now, this is a real summary version of the hero's journey, right? But this is the one that echoes back to the video which we saw earlier in the semester. So I'm going to put this right up there and obscure my face. You can see that we begin with a kind of stasis, you, okay? You're just there. 2, you need something. The hero needs something. So Wade needs to win the contest. 3, go. He begins on his journey. And 4, he seeks out some kind of next step. He seeks for the goal or for the person who's going to make the difference. And I would argue that by the end of chapter 16, he has found, all right, the copper key during the first challenge. And it's interesting to note that he also meets Artemis at this point in time. That's roughly at the end of chapter 14. So we need to talk about what happens in 15 and 16. In chapter 15, we find that Wade has sort of begun to create some kind of idea that perhaps he cannot stand alone. Madison, just so we can get a different voice into the mix here, why does he suddenly come to this realization that he cannot necessarily stand on his own in the quest for these for the Easter egg?
I'm pretty sure it's because he needed help with the second clue.
True, he absolutely does.
Not.
Go ahead.
So I would like to point out I have read the entire thing, and so I'm trying to figure out which point you're talking about.
Okay, so before chapter 16 rolls around, the end of level.
Is it the Sixers?
Mm-hmm. What did they do?
They throw up like a magic ward, and so nobody else can get in. And so literally they're the only ones that can get into the dungeon, Tomb of Annihilation.
Yep.
And they're lining themselves up to get the keys.
You got it. So after he completes the first challenge, the Sixers, there are a couple of other people who get in there and are able to win another version of the copper key, but then they seal it off. And they begin to have as many of the IOI drones, the Sixers, complete the challenges as is possible. So H is a one of, we know that Artemis is the second person to get the copper key because she was there when, and he told her about the clue to beat Asarak, the Lich King. And then we also find out that H is able to get through there as well. So he has a clue. And then that's at the beginning of chapter 13. He is contacted by IOI directly, and he meets the head of IOI's Sixer unit, the Uologist unit, Nolan Sorrento. And what's interesting here is that we get a replay of sort of the Christian mythology from the New Testament, where the heroic character is taken up to a high precipice and basically offered all of the keys, metaphorical keys to the kingdom, if they would merely give over their power to this other person. Now, it's explicitly explained that IOI, even the virtual IOI, is the tallest building in Columbus, Ohio. So it's the highest penthouse floor of the highest building. So we have a precipice, we have a kind of villainous character, and we have a virtuous character, right? Each fulfilling these temptations, these elements that formulate the temptation of Christ as it's laid out in Christian mythology in the Bible. And we know that this isn't just Mr. Fowler's odd interpretation, because on page 133, we understand that Wade preps for, this meeting, and he writes, I prepped by pulling up a search engine and learning everything I could about Sorrento. He had a PhD in computer science, and prior to that, he'd been a high-profile game designer, overseeing the creation of several third-party RPGs that ran inside the Oasis. I'd played all of his games, and they were actually pretty good. He'd been a decent coder back before he sold his soul. It's the first reference. It was obvious that why IOI had hired him to lead their lackeys. They figured that a game designer would have the best chance of solving Halliday's grand video game puzzle. But Sorrento and the Sixers had been in it for over 5 years and had nothing to show for their efforts. And now that the Gunter Avatar names are appearing on the scoreboard left and right, the IOI brass had to be freaking out. Sorrento was probably catching all kinds of heat from his superiors. I wonder if it had been Sorrento's idea to try to recruit me, Wade, or if he'd been ordered to do it. Once I'd done my homework on Sorrento, I felt like I was ready to sit down with the devil. That's our second reference. I pulled up my contacts card and attached to Sorrento's email and tapped the chat link icon at the bottom. So what's interesting about that is that we get the second sort of reference to, or obvious reference to Christian mythology. The first being Parsifal's chosen name. He is not just a knight of the Round Table. He's the knight who finds the Holy Grail, right? So that's our first link, and now we get the second moment here. Now, he goes to the meeting and essentially rejects Nolan Sorrento's offer. He kind of gets a little salty, and he says, I might take it if they fired you, so on and so forth. But there's a consequence to that. Do you remember the consequence to him trying to outfox Nolan Sorrento?
He kills his aunt.
Yeah. They actually kill not only...
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I have a feeling Sorrento would have killed them no matter what.
Yeah.
Even if Wade hadn't been salty, the moment Wade turned them down, they were dead.
Yeah. He's actually, he admits, Nolan Sorrento, that is, admits that he has broken the law, and he's actually got some information from Wade's school. Now, the way he knew that Wade attended school in the first place was that IROC, another fellow gunter that Wade had kind of dissed earlier, gives up some information to IOI for a little cash reward. And once they know he's a school student, they go in and they steal his records. Interestingly, though, they cannot get H's records. And some of us know the reason for that, but we'll get to that a little bit later in our discussions. What they do is exactly what you said, Madison. They blow up the entire stacks, the whole trailer park. And they later reported that it was a meth lab that had been operating within the stacks that had blown up as an accident. But this was actually perpetrated by IOI. They did try to kill him. And you can find that information on 145. He was putting on his gloves when he heard the explosion, and he felt the shock wave a split second after I heard the detonation, and instinctively dropped to the floor with my arms wrapped over my head. In the distance, I could hear the sound of rending metal as several trailer stacks began to collapse, ripping free of their scaffolding and crashing against one another like massive dominoes. The horrific sounds continued for what seemed like a very long time. Then it was silent again. I eventually overcame my paralysis and opened the rear door to my van. In a nightmare-like daze, I made my way to the outskirts of the junk pile, and from there I could see a giant pillar of smoke and flames rising from the opposite end of the stacks. I followed the stream of people already running in that direction along the northern perimeter. The stack containing my aunt's trailer had collapsed into a fiery, smoking ruin, along with all of the stacks adjacent to it. There was nothing there now but a massive pile of twisted, flaming metal. So he decides that he is going to need some assistance if he has any real chance of not just winning the egg, but actually competing against IOI. So he makes an assemblage of the 5 main winners, the first 5 people who had obtained the copper key. So along with Wade himself, we have Artemis, H, but then we're also introduced to 2 new characters, Daito and Shoto. Now in the film version, if you've seen that already, this is this character who's referred to as Sho. In the book, his name is Shoto because he and Daito are actually brothers in this book, in the original version of the text. And Daito and Shoto refer to the long and short swords, right, of a samurai warrior. So samurais traditionally carry 2 swords, a longer one, kind of like this, okay? So they would carry a longer blade like this one, and then the companion piece that goes with it is a shorter blade. I'm missing the companion piece on this one, but those are the 2 blades that they're referring to. A little show and tell with Mr. Fowler today. Okay, so those are elements from the book Daito and Shoto are representing. But the meeting that he holds with the high 5 does not quite go as he expects. Madison, do you remember what happens in that meeting?
They don't want to work together.
That's right. Unlike the Sixers, who are joined together by a contractual corporate agreement, the high 5 are highly individual. And they determine that they don't want to collaborate together. They think that freedom of thought and originality is what will win the day. And to be fair, that is what led them to become the members of the high 5 in the first place. But he says, let me see if I can find it. It's right around page 157 in this version of the text, if you have it. And
yeah.
At the top, there's a little bit of dialogue. I'm not suggesting anything, Wade says. I'm just stating the facts as I see them. Good, Daito replies, because it sounded like you were about to propose some sort of alliance between the five of us. And H studied him carefully and said, that wouldn't be such a terrible idea. Yes, it would, Daito answers. My brother and I hunt alone. We don't want or need your help. And then H defends them and says, a second ago you admitted to needing Parzel's help to find the Tomb of Horrors. And Daito's eyes narrow and he says, we would have found it eventually. But H doubts that. Wade tries to come between them and says, this bickering amongst ourselves isn't helping. And then H and Daito glared at each other in silence while Shoto stared up at his brother and says, we didn't come here to be insulted. We're leaving. And Wade tries to, just a second. Let's talk this out. We shouldn't part as enemies. We're on the same side. But Daito says, no, we're not. You're all strangers to us, and for all we know, any one of you could be a spy. So they're a little bit paranoid even about the Sixers trying to infiltrate the High Five. And then in chapter 16, we learn about Wade sort of moving out. He leaves Oklahoma City for Columbus, Ohio, where Gregarious Games is located. Also, I believe IOI is located in the same city. And he gets a new apartment and begins to sort of live his own life. And that's where we begin level 2, which starts off with an interesting little comment from Groucho Marx, which goes as follows. I'm not crazy about reality, but it's still the only place to get a decent meal. Later used in a different and humorous context within the film. So that takes us up to the end of the first level, the first third of the novel, as determined by Ernest Cline. Now, I think a fair amount of us have experience playing video games of one type or another. What usually happens as levels of in video games advance?
The difficulty increases.
The difficulty increases, the dangers become much more evident. So as you suggested at the top of the session here, Madison, as we begin level 2, Wade finds himself stymied. He completed the first series of challenges. He defeated the Tomb of Horrors module, part 1. He then discovered how to beat Asarak, the Lich King, in a game of Joust, the video game version of Joust. Then he found the location of the gate, which was a recreation of Halliday's childhood home. He used the key to play a flick sync, which was basically walking through the 1980s film War Games all over again. When he completed that, he received another riddle, meaning the first gate or the first challenge had been defeated. Now, he finds himself armed with a second clue, but he begins to feel a sense of confusion and defeat, because this clue is not as easily parsed, perhaps is a good word to say. It's not as easily solved as the first one, right? He's having difficulty. But that difficulty stems from a couple of different elements. Number one, like we said, he has to spend some time and attention to go and find a new place of lodging and make payments for this new home and new infrastructure that he's had to replace after the bombing of the stacks. By the way, small detail but an important one in the text. How does he manage to pay for all that again?
Which point? Because he starts by using points that he won.
Right.
Because he now has he now has cash with his points.
Right. He earns a certain amount of money
Um,
when he wins. Absolutely. There was another source of income that he's able to generate, though.
he's putting his name in things on things.
Yeah,
He's
you got it.
advertising.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. He gets endorsement deals. Yeah. And you see this echoed in the film adaptation when they're talking about the new X1 boot suit. That's the kind of illustrative technology that is utilized in the film to sort of explore what happens in the novel. So there's a Parzival approved version of the boot suit. There is a Parzival action figure. His avatar's likeness is secured for lunchboxes and so on and so forth. So he's able to make some endorsement money that way, which enables him to move about and do some things in the real world, as well as enjoy some fame in the Oasis, and set himself up with enough of an infrastructure in both the Oasis and the real world to continue the hunt. We find out later that even this revenue stream is not enough, so he has to adopt a third persona, and he lives sort of a fragmented existence. He's Wade always, but sometimes he's kind of the heroic version of this hero named Parzival, but then he also takes on a third identity as a lowly
Well, but doesn't
service tech. Go ahead.
question, doesn't he take on that third identity as semi part of a plan to infiltrate IOI?
Yes. He
I
does.
know I'm farther along than other people, but
Okay, it's a good question. He does use the identity, and I'm just going to go ahead and tell you his name is Bryce Lynch. He does use the created Bryce Lynch identity later to infiltrate IOI. When he initially begins to adopt the identity, though, it's because he's actually running out of free cash. So he does it at first as a survival necessity. But you're absolutely right. He then later uses the same identity to infiltrate IOI itself. Now, the other issue, beyond his focus being taken away under the auspices of dealing with some of the reality that's going on around him, is the fact that he's also having some personal turmoil. The source of his personal turmoil is what again?
his aunt.
His aunt has died,
Yeah.
absolutely. And even though they weren't the closest family relations, right? Wade, remember, suggests that she only took care of him so that she could receive the food vouchers that went along with being his caregiver. Wade still had great feelings for her since she was his mother's sister. And again, you know, it's kind of difficult to parse together how you feel about a family member, even a distant family member, until you no longer have them around. So he's dealing with the process of that grief, however that unfolds within him. He actually doesn't talk about it too much, but maybe the fact that he doesn't talk about it directly sort of illustrates exactly what is going on. The less that's said, the more is under the surface. Right? So we have the sort of Widow Douglas, Huckleberry Finn relationship between Wade and his aunt. And, you know, just like Huckleberry Finn cared for the Widow Douglas, Wade cares for his aunt, but it's not quite the same level of care that you would have for a real parent, perhaps. But then on top of those two factors, we have the additional issue being the heartbreak that is developing with regard to Artemis, because he does not manage to make the same kind of connection to Artemis that he feels is truly relevant. We begin the next chapter with a long chat log between Artemis and Wade, and you start to see that the sort of tethers fraying between them a little bit, even in terms of how he responds to Artemis in sort of a terse, direct way. It seems that Artemis was much more interested in what Wade could provide her in terms of information regarding how to advance toward finding the egg than he was interested in her as a competitor and person who could help up his game. She's very contest oriented. He's kind of fallen for her in a head over heels fashion. So he's going to set himself up, I think, for a bit of disappointment. And we see that played out, like I said, in the first couple of pages of chapter 17. Maybe the most awkward kind of writing that the novel has to offer. And it lasts for quite a while. It's what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 pages of writing that's just a chat log. So if you ever thought, chat writing or texting might make great writing, I would read these 4.5 pages or 5.5 pages rather before I committed to that idea, because it's not the best writing to read, that's for sure. So we get some developments between Artemis and Wade. Wade clearly needs to read the book. She's just not that into you. Or maybe he's just not, I don't remember. But anyway, it's pretty apparent that she's just not that into him. But he says at least once a day I would pull up the second clue and try to decipher its meaning. The captain conceals the jade key in a dwelling not long neglected, but you can only blow the whistle once the trophies are all collected. So this gives him more difficulty than perhaps it should. So as we get into chapter 18, we start to see their relationship begin to fray in great detail. They are basically sort of keeping to themselves until Ogden Morrow's birthday party arrives, and Wade steps out in his favorite Buckaroo Banzai outfit, and he drives to the event in his modified DeLorean, both of which, the outfit and the car, were incorporated into the film. In fact, this entire nightclub sequence was handled relatively well in the film adaptation. But during the distracted globe sequence, we find out that like Plato's parable of the cave, Artemis seems to be more connected to the earth, to reality. That might be in keeping with her nurturing attitude, or her, the linkage between the natural world and the Greek character of Artemis and her adoption of that name. But essentially, he tells Artemis that he feels that he is in love with her. And he writes on page 186, she didn't respond at first. She just looked at me in shock as our avatars continued to drift and orbit around each other, moving on autopilot. Then she switched to private voice channels so no one could eavesdrop on our conversation. You aren't in love with me, Z. You don't even know me. Yes, I do, he insists. I know you better than I've ever known anyone in my entire life. You only know what I want you to know, she responds. You only see what I want you to see. This isn't my real body or my real face. Wade says, no, I don't care about those things. I'm in love with your mind, the person that you are. And I couldn't care less about the packaging. But Artemis defensively claims, you're just saying that. There was an unsteadiness in her voice. Trust me, if you ever let me see you in person, you would be repulsed. Why do you always say that? He asks. And she says, because I'm hideously deformed, or because I'm a paraplegic, or I'm actually 63 years old. Take your pick. And Wade says, I don't care if you're all three of those things. Tell me where you want to meet you and I'll prove it. I'll get on a plane and come to wherever you are. And she shakes her head saying, you don't live in the real world. From what Z, that's her pet name for him. From what you've told me, I don't think you ever have. You're like me. You live inside of this illusion. And she motioned to our virtual surroundings. You can't possibly know what real love is. So she rejects him and says, I think we should take a break and focus our energies back on the contest. And this leads Wade into sort of a spiral of depression, which is part and parcel of what I wanted to talk to you about in regard to this week's discussion forum. So in the discussion forum question, one of the things that we find Wade doing in chapter 19 for this week's reading is that he decides he's got to do something to sort of improve his physical and emotional condition. So he locks himself out of the Oasis using a voluntary software that requires him to get some physical activity, some movement, in order to sustain his physical prowess as he gets ready to take on the next challenges in the game. Now, this is a little bit predictive, but most importantly, it harkens back to that old adage that a healthy mind and it makes for a healthy body, and vice versa. So we find him engaging in a little bit of interactive fun vis-a-vis Max Headroom. I'll put a link up there for those of you who don't know who Max Headroom is. I think you'll enjoy it. But he does make some progress in terms of becoming more physically adept to sort of mirror his mental status and ups his physical game, so to speak. Now, the question for this week is, what experiences have you all had with interactive video game technologies? And then I've been often asking a follow-up question, which is, what do you do to stay busy or active or even just in shape? I know not everybody likes to exercise or finds that particularly important, but I just found this to be an interesting element from the novel that parallels some concerns that we have in the real world. The number one health hazard in America, what do you think that is, Madison, if you had a guess?
Obesity.
Yeah. Well, specifically, it's congestive heart failure, and a whole after that, the first, I think it's stroke and then diabetes, all of which are related to issues related to obesity or inactivity, more specifically. So this inactivity that has sort of swept America is part of a larger phenomenon. And I think it's important that our author is thinking ahead to 2045, and he's using the trends that exist now, and he's just sort of taking them off scale as far as he can in order to establish just how dystopian our world could become without a change. And one of these things has to be this epidemic of obesity or health-related inactivity. So before we get to that aspect, let's back up a little bit, because Wade says he does get some activity. Perhaps the most majority of his activity is something he gets from interacting with the Oasis. He's actually able to run around and get some mobility and fun out of the activities that are required through game playing in the Oasis. But he says it's not enough. And I think what's another interesting parallel to our reality is the idea that integrating physical activity with video games has long been a target for video game developers. So before we jump into a discussion about health, let's just talk real informally about what kind of haptic or sensory peripheral devices you have used before. Have you used any of these kinds of peripheral devices before, like the Kinect system or the Wii system?
Yeah, so we have a Wii,
Mm-hmm.
the original Wii, not the Wii U.
Mm-hmm.
But the most impressive one that I've seen is actually for the Nintendo Switch.
Mm.
So they have like kickboxing. So you put them in your hands, the controls detach, and you put them in your hands and you can use them to punch. The other one was Ring Fit,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually really interesting. They ran out of those
Wow.
during the pandemic. You physically could not find them. They were selling them for hundreds and hundreds of dollars on like eBay and things because people wanted to work out during the pandemic. The beginning, when you could not go anywhere, and they didn't have them. And it's literally a ring, and you slide in the stick on one, and then you put the other on your leg, and you're literally like moving it around, and it's reading whatever it reads and then reacting.
Interesting. Yeah, that I know another student had mentioned that in this week's discussion forums, and I had heard I think maybe your description is actually queuing up some memories I may have had, but it's nice to understand a little bit more about what exactly this Ring Fit system is or what it's comprised of. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. How do you find it? Do you like it? Is it
And
difficult?
I don't have it. I was literally looking for it when the pandemic hit. I was saving up for it, and then it was gone. So I don't have it. But from what I can tell, it's the best. And from the reviews, it's the best integrated game with actual like workout stuff and things, registering movements. It makes you want to work out rather than just being like, okay, with the Wii, okay, I'm bowling. I don't have to get up out of my chair and I can just swing the remote.
Right.
So my arm is getting a workout, but nothing else is.
Right. Sort of like those cartoons that we see when people are playing a video game real vigorously, they can get like like really muscly thumbs or something like that. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but this is exciting sort of development to hear about because peripherals or haptics go back quite a ways. So peripherals and haptics are slightly different. Peripherals could go back to all the way to arcades. because essentially a joystick or control device is a peripheral device that helps you, interact with the game. Beyond that, kind of shooting and sports-based hunting games use peripherals in the shape of a light gun or light sensor. And then the first actual haptic, which is an interactive device that you use physically in order to simulate motion, that I am aware of. And there may be some more obscure ones out there, but the first one was the Nintendo Power Pad, which was released with a game called like Track and Field, I think. And the idea was that you would physically move your legs and pump up and down, and there were buttons on a pad that would emulate your avatar's ability to run, jump, or perform other feats. Now, unfortunately, very savvy children found out that after a while, if you would run and sweat and work up your physical abilities there, two things would happen. The sensors in the pad would over time wear out because you'd be jumping and pounding on them. And number two, you yourself would become physically tired from the activity. So what they found out is that if you sat down and pounded the pad with your hands, you could achieve the same effect as if you were actually running. Now, again, that does give you a little bit of a workout, pumps your arms, and sort of gives you a little cardiovascular pump, but it's not quite the way it was intended. The next peripheral or haptic that came out was the Power Glove. And that was based on some really detailed research. But when it went to market, all of the nuance that was required to make the Power Glove work really well, as it did in demonstration, was not very practical in terms of how it would work in reality. So they had to scale down the workability of the Power Glove. And it ultimately didn't end up functioning like a haptic at all. It was more like a traditional peripheral, which did well at market, but didn't actually fulfill the promise that its marketing claimed. Today, we are moving rapidly toward actual haptics. There is a company right now that is producing a sensory suit for VR games, very much in the mold of what we saw in the film version of Ready Player One. And of course, the VR headsets and hand devices that we are able to use through many of the VR manufacturers are achieving this kind of reality that we see aforementioned in the text. The thing that surprised me is that I did just a very little bit of research, and I found out that they actually do have haptic treadmills already, similar to the kind of treadmill that is discussed in the book. Those do not work very well from what I've heard. They're very sluggish compared to what we see in the film versions and to what's described in terms of movement in the novel. But the fact that they exist at all in any capacity surprised me. So we are moving toward that technology, it seems like. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure. I have to question the idea behind the success of that kind of infrastructure, because game playing is mentally sort of associated with relaxation and fun. And not everybody is able to connect relaxation and fun with physical endeavor. So I don't know if that is something that will be successful over time. It certainly seems like that's where we would like to go as a group of humans and as a group of game players, but I'm kind of undecided about how effective this would be in reality. Do you have any thoughts about this, Madison?
I think like every game,
Mm-hmm.
it's person to person. So some people, so for example, I love Zelda.
Mm-hmm.
Zelda's a puzzle based game
Right.
where you have to figure things out. And some people feel that like figuring things out isn't relaxing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I don't want to have to think about how to solve this puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just, you know, shoot things.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's what they find relaxing.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I'm a platform gamer, so I don't want to have to think anything more than like, Mario, where it's jump and throw like a fireball,
Mm-hmm.
which is completely and utterly different than Zelda. Um and I think it's the same thing in like real life where, okay, someone may play a video game to relax, but somebody might watch TV or read a book or go for a walk. I think it's very subjective to each person, and there are people out there that would like that, like exercising and playing a game at the same time. It's not everybody.
Right.
Just like every game is not designed to reach everybody. It's to reach a bigger audience. But I mean it's not to reach everybody. There are acceptances that, okay, I'm not going to be able to reach so and so, somebody who's doesn't want to play a game where the entire thing is a goose picking on people,
Right.
or that may just not appeal to somebody, and that's just how video games work. It's how everything in life works.
Yeah. So do you think there would be a market for this then? It sounds like like you suggest there would be a market for interactive virtual games.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's already a market for it. Like if I could play I don't know, something like Luigi's Mansion in virtual reality, I would totally do it. I don't think there's a VR version of that game
Yeah,
where
I
you're
don't know.
playing as Luigi. Um or even things like there's VR for first person shooters. I mean, I think that's completely and utterly, some people like it, some people don't.
Sure.
It's all up to the person.
I think
There's
that's fair.
already a there's already a want for it.
Mhm.
It's just getting the right people to put in the money and actually buy it.
I think that's a fair assessment. If like you said, if there's a marketplace at all, there will be a marketplace for people um, who would be willing and able to respond to that demand. And if there's a want or desire, a product will arise to meet that demand. And I think that's certainly going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen as quickly as the market thinks it will. Obviously, there's a cost ratio involved there. Right now, VR headsets, really good ones, and are expensive. And the library of VR games is a little bit limited, but they're certainly very interesting from a playing dynamic. I've only played a PlayStation VR games plural before, but they're very immersive in as much as the headset and your reaction. It's really kind of funny. There's even a whole genre of videos. They're just reaction videos looking at someone reacting to a virtual game and sort of laughing about their very visceral reaction to what's going on in the virtual world around them. So I think that once that dynamic is offset enough, once there are more games available, and the cost for the technology are offset one against the other, I think we'll see sort of VR take off a little bit. I'll be interested to see if VR gaming takes off and whether or not they go back and revisit classic games. So, for example, you mentioned the Mario Brothers earlier. I think you mentioned Luigi's Mansion. And that made me think back to like even the original Super Mario Brothers on Nintendo. Imagine a three-dimensional immersive experience like that, where you're actually throwing the fireball and making the jumps, and swimming. That would be interesting.
I would like to point out that they do have VR for Super Mario Odyssey, which is the new Mario.
Interesting.
So they do have it. You can play as Mario in VR, from what I'm aware of.
That's really interesting. That's interesting, because then I could see if they could create such an immersive experience as that, I could see myself, getting interested in the entire idea of a virtual reality simulation. But it would have to be an engaging enough of an experience. Marcellus, any thoughts about this? Do you think that VR will become a reality in the future? VR gaming?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's obviously in like an infant stage right now. But I mean, yeah, definitely I can see in the future they want, especially like game makers, they probably want more immersive, content. So I can definitely see it like, even 5 years down the line, it probably being a more common thing than we think. Just look at what we're doing now with a Zoom meeting. I feel that in the future that'll be more integrated to like where it appears we're all in the same room.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I think it'll take off eventually, just to make life easier, in a sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I try to be a positive, person and keep a can-do attitude in the forefront of my mind. But if I allowed myself to think about potential negatives, what if, the coronavirus came back, as it's in some parts of the country is resurging right now. What if it once again became difficult and deadly to do things, potentially deadly, to interact in a person-to-person function? Well, I would hope that we would actually continue to improve things like Zoom meetings. And I would hope that a virtual experience would eventually become something akin to a compromise between an authentic environment and something that was virtually safe for us to inhabit. I hope that when and if we achieve that, it will be out of our own interests and our own volition, as opposed to something that's forced upon us by unfortunate circumstances. But yeah, I would love to see something like a Zoom classroom, a Zoom virtual classroom environment where we had a shared or similar background or something like that. That'd be great. Obviously, right now, I can say that it would be great. Well, we'll see.
It'd be much needed right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Last semester, we were about right here, the midway session, and we were meeting face-to-face in classrooms, 2 to 4 days, 2 days a week. And when this happened, a lot of my students were just sort of like, wow, this is, kind of interesting, because it's not quite virtual, but yet we're able to, you know, to some effect, see one another. We're able to interact with one another. And this is kind of like the beta version of what the Oasis had to offer. And I said, yeah, I wouldn't have predicted that the novel could be anywhere near this close to something approaching reality, but that's where we found ourselves. And now the novelty, of course, has worn off. It was pretty amazing the first couple of weeks when that we were able to continue the process. But now, having gone through a whole semester virtually like this, I still think it's fascinating. But I think the novelty has worn off for a lot of students. And I know especially with very young students, it has not quite made the impact it has in advanced education. Sorry, I cut you off. You were going to say?
No, I was just saying, yeah, at this point, you're right. Like, it's the novelty's worn off just because we just don't have the infrastructure for it. You know, or some people don't, you know, and yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But hopefully, like I said, I see in the future, VR taking off, hopefully, and stuff like this. Hopefully that means, you know, internet connections get better. People, you know, have the actual equipment to be able to partake in it. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I agree with you. Like, it was interesting at first because, you know, I work with the schools, the school district in DeKalb, and it was interesting at first. You know, it was, you know, being home. You know, but now it's just like, okay, you know, you have to contact people and talk to people, and it's just, you know, it's a barrier as of right now. So
Commute times are a lot shorter. But yeah, we had difficulties. I live real close to Byron. If you're familiar with Byron, Illinois, they're host to a nuclear power plant, so they get a lot of, you know, they have a lot of coin. But even a relatively well-to-do district such as Byron, they had difficulties making sure that everybody had service, had the equipment to connect to the service if it was available. And then lastly, you know, making sure that even with these things provided, even with technology, even with access to the technology provided, that students still showed up. And they had students even in Byron that were just like, they never came back. You know, they never finished their
Right.
coursework, nothing. They were just like, bye, you know, I'm off. So there are certainly some things that need to be put into place before anything approaching the version of education that we have in the book would become achievable. But this has been sort of revelatory, the sort of forced move online. We'll see where it takes us. Lastly, just going to quickly double check with you both. Marcellus, I believe you already commented in this week's discussion forum thread, but we'll start with you and then we'll go to Madison. What do you like to do to stay active? What do you do to keep busy?
Me personally, I'll either, you know, sometimes I'll just randomly go for a walk, you know, for like an hour, just kind of around my neighborhood. Pretty much that's it. I do have an exercise bike in my house, so I'll just jump on that. But yeah, I mean, I really don't like go to the gym or anything, especially, I mean, I really don't want to go to the gym right now anyway, but yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I just, you know, go for walks, you know, go run errands, get out the house, pretty much.
A lot of people have taken up walking, and as the here in Northern Illinois, obviously we have a limited time frame in terms of our outdoor activity. We're basically sort of relegated to keeping ourselves indoors for about 3, sometimes 4 months out of the year. Those winter months can get really brutal. But as the semester warmed up last semester, a lot of people were walking and then walking with pets. Pets, I guess, really helped out during this past pandemic. Here in Illinois, we're, of course, just opening the state back up now so that we can have a little bit more to do. And some of our local parks and so on and so forth have been reopened, and some of our gyms too. And I think that's helped immensely. I remember one report that I saw, though, I think it was out of Rockford, Illinois. I can't remember if that was precisely the place, but I think one of the animal shelters completely emptied their kennel because everybody came in to adopt dogs or cats, because that gave you an excuse to go out and be active to some extent. So I thought that was kind of wonderful, for the sake of the dogs and cats, if no one else. But yeah, that's a great way to get out and stay active. Madison, how about yourself?
Do you mean like stay active as in working out?
Working out or keeping
Because I
yourself,
don't.
or just keeping yourself busy.
Oh, keeping my. I have 3 D&D games
Mhm.
that usually total around 3 hours each a week.
Mhm.
Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday. And then the rest of my time is spent in front of a computer watching either Critical Role or other like Let's Plays on YouTube.
Mhm.
And then I do like a Zelda randomizer for Minish Cap if I can find the time to do that with all of the other homework and TV and stuff I watch. So I tend not to get physically active.
Okay, that's fair. At least you're engaging your mind and keeping yourself mentally healthy that way. About how many people are in your campaign?
Which one?
The Tuesday Thursday sessions. Were you Tuesday Wednesday Thursday or Tuesday Thursday?
So I have a campaign on Tuesday, I have a
Tuesday.
different campaign on Wednesday, and a
Okay.
different campaign on Saturday.
Okay, so about how many people participate in each of those campaigns then? The Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday.
Let's see. Tuesday. There's about 5 of us, 6 with the DM, including me. Wednesday, there's 5 with the DM, including me. And Saturday is 5 with the DM, including me.
So those are pretty big groups.
So with me and all of them.
Yeah. Those are pretty big groups though.
They're for D&D, that's a nice a nice sized group. You
Mhm.
don't want to go over 6.
Right. That sounds very good. So one of the other things that you mentioned is YouTube. I've been watching more YouTube over the last
Yes.
3 months, I think. And part of that, of course, is due to the fact that a lot, not all, but a lot of YouTube content can be generated within, a closed space. And sometimes it's just as entertaining
Right.
as other forms of television or film that you might see. And a lot of film and television production halted halted during the coronavirus, and we had to look for something for replacements. I think Netflix and YouTube have like boomed in the past several months because of the coronavirus, and people are hungry for content. So if anybody out there is watching this and you've ever toyed around with the idea of creating a YouTube channel, this may be the time for you to start.
Yeah, so the TV shows that I enjoy watching are all in the UK for the most part.
Mhm.
So the only way I get them is if someone is extremely nice and posts them on YouTube.
Yeah. That can be.
So because they don't have licensure on some of the images in the TV show, especially the one. They have copyright for showing images in the UK, which is fine. But then images that they show on the TV show, because it's a quiz show and they show pictures and things
Mhm.
and play music, they don't necessarily have the copyright to play it
Yeah.
here,
Right. Yeah.
which means they can't release it here.
That is unfortunate. That is an unfortunate element of YouTube. They're very strict on those copyright laws.
Oh no, it's not YouTube. It's physically they can't publish it here, so YouTube is the only place I can get it.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Because it's BBC content, but they can't air it on BBC America because of copyright issues.
Fair enough. I want to pause and pivot just for a minute here. Let me share this real quick. Just going back to the homepage for a minute. I just wanted to share this piece about GreenGuard's social games and virtual goods. That's, again, for next time on Desire to Learn. That will be sort of the feature point for our next discussion. It's a little bit dense in terms of reading, so I'm going to break it up into 2 sessions. But GreenGuard, I think, has a lot to say about some of the very things that we're talking about. And he also talks about some of these interesting elements from our book that we've discussed in this session, particularly the issues about how money and revenue are generated through online venues, and how that virtual currency can translate into a real world good or service. So if you're a student pursuing a business focus, or you're interested in the dynamics of how economy works, this article might be the one that you've been waiting for this semester. We'll certainly see if that's the case. So for today, I'm going to pause and check with my 2 students and see if they have any other comments. Madison, anything else for today?
I don't think so.
Okay, Marcellus, anything else that you wanted to comment on for today?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I'm going to invite you 2 to hang on for just a little bit longer. I'm going to end the recording, but not the session, because I want to give you some time to see if you to ask questions about anything related to the class. So until next time, this is Mr. Fowler signing off. I wish you a pleasant day and an even better tomorrow. We'll see you then.